Let's just start recording and I'll start letting people in, and then I'll start after like 30 seconds or a minute. Just give people some time to log on.
Yeah. The grace period.
Yeah. I think I got everything. So hi everyone who's joined so far. We'll get started in just a second. And hello everyone who's joined so far. We'll get started in just a few seconds. All right, well, as people come in, I'll just start the intro. So hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on for this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm a programming librarian here at Cary Library. Before we begin, if you're having any technical issues, message me in the chat and I can hopefully try to help. For any questions this evening, please use the Q&A button. This program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation. And with us this evening is Evan Greer. She is a trans and queer activist, writer, and musician based in Boston. She's the director of the viral digital rights group Fight for the Future and is an expert on issues at the intersection of tech policy and human rights, particularly surrounding LGBTQ+ communities and free expression. Greer tours internationally as a speaker and performer and is a regular guest on TV and radio and writes frequently for outlets like The Washington Post, CNN, Time, NBC Newsweek, and Wired. Her last album, Spotify's Surveillance, was featured by NPR, Rolling Stone, and Pitchfork, and as she wrote, hit the very bottom of the Billboard charts. So please welcome Evan Greer.
Thanks so much, Matt. Super appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining. Super delighted to be here. Sort of wish we could all be in the library together, but I don't mind doing this from home. And none of you can tell that I'm wearing pajama pants from the waist down. So that is the beauty of this type of environment. So yeah, thanks so much, Matt, for the intro. I'll skip introducing myself because you've just done a phenomenal job doing that. But I will talk a little bit more about my organization, Fight for the Future, and then I'll give a quick overview of what this talk is going to focus on around artificial intelligence and its use within surveillance and how scary that is. But most importantly, and I plan to try to spend as much time as possible not scaring the crap out of you all, but focused on what we can actually do about this together. Because it is a collective problem, not an individual problem, and one that requires collective action. So that's really going to be where I hope we leave things this evening. But I'm also going to try to spend as much or leave as much time as possible for questions and discussion to really get into answering, hopefully, some of what people want to know about this topic. So I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing, a little bit of jumping between links and images and videos. And despite being supposedly an expert on tech policy, my tech skills are so-so. So there may be some bumps in the road, but I think we'll get through this together. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Hopefully you won't see anything terribly embarrassing. And I'm going to pull up my slideshow here. And thanks, Matt, for making this great image promoting the event tonight. So I figured this is a library talk, so we better start with some books. And so very quickly, I'm just going to list off a few books that have informed what I'm going to talk about tonight, books that I've really read and enjoyed, and that I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about this topic and diving a bit deeper into it to check out. And I confirmed with Matt ahead of time that the library has these books, or at least Unmasking AI on the left, and probably the other ones, I would guess. And I do want to say clearly that really so much of my thinking on this topic, and really so much of the global human rights consensus on the topic of artificial intelligence and surveillance, has been informed by and driven by the work of predominantly Black women specifically. And I think it's really important that we say that clearly and give researchers and experts the credit that they deserve for the foundational work that they've done that has enabled the type of public debate that we're having about technology, how we should use it in our society and what the rules governing it should be. So quickly, all the way on the left here is a brand new book from my friend, Dr. Joy Buolamwini, who is an former MIT researcher and the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, a phenomenal organization that is doing exactly what its name describes, fighting for justice in a world driven by algorithms. And her book is phenomenal and touches on many of the topics that I'll be speaking about tonight. The second is by Dr. Sophia Amuda-Noble, Algorithms of Oppression. This again is a foundational work on this topic. And then finally, Simone Brown, who has really traced the history of surveillance dating all the way back to lantern laws in the post-slavery United States to modern forms of over-policing and surveillance experience within Black and Brown communities, predominantly in communities of color, low-income communities more broadly. So a few books to start you with, and then a few more. I'll also just say all the way on the right here, Kashmir Hill, who's a phenomenal journalist at the New York Times, has a new book, a relatively new book about face recognition surveillance specifically. And I highly recommend it, not only because it features some of the work that I'm going to talk about tonight, but also because it's a very readable introduction to the topic. And then these two books on the left, I'll just say, are not specifically about surveillance or technology, but they're foundational texts about abolition that have strongly informed my perspectives about what types of measures are needed to address the harms of these types of technologies in our society. So just a few books to get you started. But now I'll just quickly overview again kind of what I'm going to talk about today. And then I'll quickly introduce Fight for the Future, and then I'll start talking about it. So I'm going to go over what is AI surveillance, what is artificial intelligence, what are the ways that it can be used for surveillance, how bad is it now? We're going to talk about what's being used here in Massachusetts. I'll give a little bit of overview about what's happening across the country and around the world. Then we'll talk about how bad can it get and kind of dive a little bit into the nightmare scenarios that perhaps we all can envision or have seen in sci-fi movies, but have hoped would never come to pass. But then again, as I said at the outset, most importantly, I'm going to zoom in on what can we do about it. And I'm going to give some case studies and examples of what my organization, Fight for the Future, has done that has been effective. And we've actually had some pretty great successes, even as of yesterday, that I'm going to go over. So hopefully that will leave folks feeling a little bit inspired rather than terrified. And folks can then go out and become active on this issue rather than just losing sleep at night over it. And again, throughout the conversation, do feel free to drop questions in the chat. We can do kind of a dedicated Q&A at the end, but I'm also happy to answer questions as they come up. I do not have a linear script that I'm trying to plow through in 20 minutes. I'm going to kind of do my best to cover this topic and bounce around a little bit between some of the different things that I have to show you. And so first of all, I'm going to actually show off a little bit just because Matt, explained to you all that I'm both a musician and an activist. And some people sometimes you're like, well, how does that work? How do you split your time between the two? And one of the answers is that it's challenging, and I never sleep and don't make enough money, and do the best that I can. But the other answer is that there's a strong intersection for me between the art that I make and the work that I do. And so Matt mentioned my last album was called Spotify is Surveillance. Here's my 6.7 Pitchfork review. Not so great, but not so bad. And I launched that album with a campaign, and this will be kind of the start of showing off some of the examples of how I use my work and how Fight for the Future operates. So when I released this album, we actually launched it with a campaign targeting the company Spotify that had filed a patent to use voice recognition software to listen to our conversations and then use that data to recommend music to us. And so by releasing the album alongside a campaign, we were able to kind of leverage the press and attention that we got from it. We organized a letter that was signed by more than 180 prominent musicians, including Laura Jane Grace from Against Me, Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, many others, Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill. And that actually led to Spotify saying that they would drop their plans to use this type of voice recognition software within their technology. And so that is an example of A, how activism can be effective, and B, how this kind of intersection of art and activism can work hand in hand. And so quickly, I'm going to start off by playing a little bit of one of my music videos from that album. And this song is called Surveillance Capitalism, and it kicks off with a quote from the author Ursula K. Le Guin that maybe some of you know. Go check out one of her books from the library too. Like that, or
We
someone else
live
let
in
me know if you can't
capitalism.
hear the audience.
Its power
Audio's good,
seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings.
Once consent was manufactured, now it's harvested for clicks. Algorithms make decisions. Filter bubbles make us sick. We're all connected to machines. Hate every second, but we just can't look away. We all wanna be seen, but behind the screen, there's a nightmare dressed up as a dream. And we can't wake up.
Private companies basically have more power and more information on us than governments do, without any sort of infrastructure to hold them accountable.
Every thought, every emotion.
How do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Charted, processed, optimized.
Senator, we run ads.
Eye movements, facial expressions. Manipulation, monetized. We're all connected to machines. Hate every second, but we just can't look away. We all wanna be seen, but behind the screen, there's a nightmare dressed up as a dream. And we can't wake up.
There's a difference between knowing something and doing something about it. We assume that there should be a prison system, there should be a surveillance apparatus. I think that these assumptions need to be questioned.
An infinite playground, a library, human creativity. They paved it over, put up walls. Now it's billboards, big bucks, shopping malls. Hate every second, but we just can't look away. We all wanna be seen, but behind the screen, there's a nightmare dressed up as a dream. And we can't wake up.
Neither math nor machines can extract 4 centuries of white
And we
supremacy
can't wake
from
up.
American policing. Neither math nor machines can extract 4 centuries of
And
white
we can't
supremacy
wake up.
from American policing. Simply inserting digital technologies into discriminatory policing without addressing its fundamental flaws can only serve to supersede that discrimination, can only serve to reduce community safety, and can only violate the civil rights of the most vulnerable among us. Nothing else can happen.
All right, so that is my song Surveillance Capitalism, and that's Malkia Cyril on the outro there, a phenomenal surveillance and racial justice activist and the founder of Media Justice, an organization that we at Fight for the Future work with regularly. So I've talked about Fight for the Future a little bit, and I may as well quickly tell you who we are and what we do. So Fight for the Future is a nonprofit. We focus on technology and the policies that govern it. And as we say here on our website, we're an interdisciplinary collective. So we are artists, we're engineers, we're activists, and we're technologists. And we all kind of combine our expertise together to accomplish public policy victories that perhaps would have been seen to be impossible before being afforded the tools and the amplification that technology gives us. And that's kind of where we see the double-edged sword here, where we understand that technology has the power to uplift and to empower and to give more people a voice than ever before in our democracy, but it also has the power to oppress and to violate and to harm. And so we're very much fighting at that intersection and working for a world where technology is primarily a force for good rather than primarily a force for tyranny and for greed. And swapping back to my slides here, I'll just quickly explain a little bit of how Fight for the Future works. You know, we are a small activist collective. We work remotely across the country. We've done everything from organizing a nationwide series of rock concerts to oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, to crowdfunding billboards to call out politicians that voted to gut basic privacy laws. Ted Cruz loved these billboards so much that he put them up on one of his stupid little poster boards that he likes to show in Congress. We've organized a series of campaigns targeting companies, encouraging them to adopt end-to-end encryption. And broadly speaking, we use the internet as a tool to mobilize people at a scale that forces lawmakers and elected officials to do their jobs, which, to be honest, is a more difficult task than it might sound. So going back to my kind of outline here, I want to start with what is artificial intelligence powered surveillance. And to talk about that, I'm going to first start with just talking about what is artificial intelligence. And I'll stop sharing my screen here for a moment so that we can see each other and be a little bit human while we talk about robots. But I think the first thing to understand is that effectively all artificial intelligence systems are built on top of surveillance. So even if we're talking about something like generative AI, like ChatGPT, which probably most of you are familiar with, or DALL-E, or other kind of image generation AI, all of it is based on scraping the internet and basically ingesting massive amounts of data and then using that data to train computer software to do things. And so whether we're talking about a system that's built for predicting the outcome of a healthcare procedure, or a system that's built for predicting the weather, or a system that's built for predicting what word comes next in a sentence, all of it is sort of built on top of the commercial surveillance that has become effectively the business model of most of the modern internet. And I think that's really important for folks to understand, because the moment that we're in now was not inevitable. It's a national embarrassment that we do not have a basic privacy law here in the United States. And what that means is that companies are free to collect almost any amount of intimate data about all of us, to store that data, and to use it for almost any purpose that they can imagine. That's not true everywhere. In Europe, there is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regime, which is not perfect, but does impose some limits on what types of data companies can collect. Many other countries around the world do have basic privacy laws in place. But here in the United States, we have effectively no basic privacy laws. And that has allowed for the flourishing of surveillance capitalism as the basic business model of the internet. And you've probably heard the phrase that if the product is free, you are the product, right? So when we're using Instagram, when we're using Spotify, when we're using Audible or Amazon's products, or really almost any other web service that comes for free, we are paying for it with our intimate data and information about all of us. That then powers most of these companies' targeted advertising as their primary revenue model. That model of allowing companies to collect so much data is what has created the sort of ecosystem that artificial intelligence is thriving on top of. So I think that's important for people to understand, because when we think about artificial intelligence surveillance, we tend to think about movies like Minority Report, or things like facial recognition, people being pulled out of a crowd by dudes in black suits. And that is a very real concern, and we do need to be talking about things like that. But we need to understand that there's so many sort of more mundane uses of artificial intelligence that are still built on surveillance, and that can still have profound and discriminatory applications in our society. So, for example, there's a company called HireVue that for a while was offering other companies AI-powered hiring software, where effectively I would get on a Zoom interview with you, the interviewer, and the software would tell the interviewer things like, the person seems nervous. We're analyzing their emotions. We're determining whether what they're telling us is truthful. And what we know, unfortunately, is like almost all artificial intelligence powered systems, these types of systems are flawed in the sense that if you feed them faulty data, they will give you faulty results. And I mentioned Dr. Joy Buolamwini at the outset of this talk, and I pointed to her book. She is one of the researchers that was able to prove with data that, for example, most modern facial recognition surveillance algorithms disproportionately misidentify people with darker skin and people who are not white men. So that's an example of where, because these data sets were trained on primarily images of white men, the facial recognition algorithms now give a discriminatory output. And so when you layer that type of discriminatory technology on top of a system that's already discriminatory, like, for example, hiring within corporate America, what you end up doing is automating and exacerbating existing forms of discrimination. And when it comes down to it, that's really what artificial intelligence powered surveillance does. Artificial intelligence is about machine learning. So it's machines ascertaining and inferring things based on what you kind of tell them by giving them data, and then they give you an output. And that can be used, as I mentioned before, for predictive policing, where law enforcement in different communities are using data that they ingest to tell them, here's where we should focus. That can come in the form of predictive analytics within healthcare, where healthcare institutions have actually used algorithms to determine who should get a surgery and who shouldn't. Now, that's literally a life or death situation. But what we know is that, again, just to use that example, if the data is tainted, then the outcomes will be tainted. So in terms of an algorithm that we use, what that was used to determine who should get a surgery, it was basically looking at what are the end results. If we look back at all the people who've gotten the surgery in the past, which ones of them lived the longest, and then we can use that to determine who we should give the surgery to. But if that data doesn't take into account the fact that, for example, people of color have shorter life expectancies because of things like discrimination, because of things like police violence, because of things like environmental injustice, then the algorithm will disproportionately say that white people should get the surgery, not because they're actually more medically likely to succeed given the surgery, but because the flawed data that was input into the algorithm is then giving a discriminatory output. And right now, there are very few laws in place to prevent that type of systemic discrimination. So we're starting to adopt machine learning and algorithmic decision-making into almost every aspect of our lives, from education to healthcare to housing to whether you can get a loan to policing, without meaningful safeguards and oversight. And that's really what makes AI-powered surveillance so dangerous. We're taking systems, whether, again, it's policing, whether it's government systems for accessing benefits that we know already have discrimination baked into them, and then we're allowing computers to effectively automate and speed up that discrimination without having effective safeguards in place to protect people's basic rights. That's kind of the core flaw of using artificial intelligence to make life or death decisions. And that's why we need, as Dr. Joy Buolamwini puts it, algorithmic justice, meaning meaningful transparency, accountability, audits, and the types of things that will ensure that if we are deciding that we're going to entrust an algorithm or a computer with making a decision, that we have basic transparency and accountability in terms of who actually gets to make that decision and which communities are most affected by it. So that's a little bit just kind of getting into what is AI and how does it interact with surveillance. To get a little bit more specific, I'm going to zoom in here in Massachusetts. So here in Massachusetts, we're actually pretty lucky. We're one of the few states that does have some policies on the books. If you live in Boston or in the Boston area, you may live in a town that already has banned AI surveillance like facial recognition, for example. So my kid goes to Boston Public Schools. I do not have to worry that Boston Public Schools are using facial recognition surveillance to conduct attendance because it's illegal here in Boston. And that's thanks to the work of folks like Cade Crockford at the Massachusetts ACLU and many others in a broad coalition here in Massachusetts that have worked on this issue. But we do know that on the Mass Pike, for example, there are automated license plate readers that are effectively cameras that are taking pictures of license plates, scanning those license plates, and then ascertaining information about who's going where, what cars are driving. We're using that to collect tolls, but there's actually nothing preventing Massachusetts State Police or other law enforcement from using that information for other law enforcement purposes or from handing it over to immigration or other government agencies. And so that's another example of where we see this type of automated surveillance doesn't necessarily stay where it starts. So a company or a government institution might collect data for one purpose, but without meaningful safeguards in place, that data can easily be used in ways that perhaps no one would have expected when the program was started. Zooming out a little bit across the country, I'm going to show a few websites and things that will give folks a sense of just the scale that we're talking about here. So give me a moment while I figure out my tech problem. So this is a map that my organization, Fight for the Future, put together that shows both across the country where we know that facial recognition surveillance specifically is being used, and also where there are efforts or ordinances or local attempts to fight it. And you can see this map is pretty full. Their police and other companies are using facial recognition in a wide variety of places. I'll zoom in quickly here on the Northeast where we are so that folks can see a little bit. And you can see some good and bad here in Massachusetts, as I mentioned before. So we know, for example, that at Logan Airport, US Customs and Border Protection are using facial recognition on people that are entering the US. This is a Customs and Border Protection program run by the federal government. It's happening at a number of airports across the country. It's not uncontested. Our own senator, Senator Markey here in Massachusetts, has written several oversight letters to Customs and Border Patrol asking about this program and whether it leads to discriminatory outcomes for people entering the US. But you can see some good stuff here too. These green circles here are places where facial recognition has been banned. So Somerville and Brookline, for example, have already banned facial recognition. It's not on this map, but out in Northampton, they've done it as well. I don't know why we don't have it on here. Maybe I haven't gone far enough, I guess. Massachusetts is bigger than you think. But regardless, I think this map can show kind of the dual dynamic here, which is that this technology is spreading very, very quickly, but efforts to fight back against it are also spreading. And basically everywhere that this technology pops up, you see local communities fighting back against it, resisting it, and pushing for basic oversight and a democratic process around what types of technology our government and law enforcement agencies can use, and what types of policies should protect us from abuse. Zooming back into kind of what makes artificial intelligence surveillance different. So surveillance itself is not at all a new issue. If you go back all the way to the times of kings and queens, we know that many large empires employed literally thousands of spies that would be in a tavern, listening to what people say and reporting that information back to those in power to ensure that they could maintain their power. And you can draw a direct line from that type of very interpersonal and kind of slow surveillance to, as Dr. Simone Brown wrote about, the Lantern Laws and other types of surveillance that were employed to enforce chattel slavery in the United States, to Nazi Germany using the yellow stars and other forms of surveillance to control and enact a genocide upon an entire population, to the modern day where law enforcement agencies, government agencies, not just in the United States, but around the world, use surveillance not so much for safety, but to maintain control. Perhaps some of the most extreme examples of this we've seen are in modern China, where facial recognition, metadata collection, intercepting of messages, and other forms of surveillance are used not just to enforce laws, but also to enforce social norms There was one particularly egregious example in a region of China where the local government used facial recognition to shame people who walked around outside in their pajamas, right? Something that's not against the law, but that perhaps violates a social norm. And that's really the danger of this type of surveillance. When you bring it to its extremes, it enables enforcement of rules in a sort of totalitarian way. And something that I always kind of encourage people to think about is we often frame privacy or freedom from surveillance as being about what we have to hide. To me, privacy is about our ability as a human society to evolve and to change. If we can enforce rules completely and perfectly every single time, we don't have any space to test whether those rules are right. I often ask myself, if the US government had had ubiquitous facial recognition surveillance in the 1970s, when the LGBTQ rights movement was starting to get off the ground, and it was still illegal to be gay in many states across the US, would our modern movement have ever formed? Would we have accomplished the type of massive societal shifts and legal shifts that our movement has accomplished over the last several decades if the government or law enforcement agencies or even right-wing religious institutions had the technical capacity to target the leaders of our movement in a systematic and almost complete way? And I think the answer to that is no, which is why, again, from my perspective, when we talk about freedom from surveillance, it's not just about, what do we have to hide or can we kind of keep our secrets? It's about, do we have space to evolve as a human society? Do we have space to keep moving forward? And if we accept kind of totalitarian surveillance, whether it's from corporations or from government, what we're effectively saying is that we're okay with the status quo. We think things are good enough now and that we don't need to continue testing our rules and norms and evolving as a society. I don't know about everyone watching this, but at least for myself, I do not feel like the current state of the world is good enough. I would like to see it improve. And so that's why I believe there needs to be space where humans can come together and converse and engage free from intrusion and free from surveillance. So that's my little kind of spiel about why I personally care so very much about this issue. I do see a few questions popping up in the chat, and I will get to them for sure. So keep jumping them in there. If stuff comes up that's kind of like directly related to stuff I'm in the middle of, I'll address it right away, and otherwise we'll save it for the Q&A at the end. So I've gone over a little bit of kind of what types of AI surveillance are being used. How bad can it get? It can get really, really bad. I think often in the US and other Western countries, folks tend to point to China and sort of be like, well, we don't want to become like that. And I do think it's important that we own the fact that we do already have a significant and oppressive surveillance apparatus here in the US, as well as in a lot of Europe. The United Kingdom is arguably one of the most surveilled countries in the world. And many other US allies are as well, including countries that have very repressive laws, target journalists, target activists, target LGBTQ communities and others. And so it's important that we keep that in perspective and don't turn this into something where we're sort of pointing our finger over there rather than looking in the mirror at how we have enabled this type of totalitarian surveillance across the world. Broadly speaking, I'm going to kind of try and give some case studies that both show some ways that facial recognition and other biometric and artificial intelligence powered surveillance technologies are being used. But as I mentioned a few times, also what we're doing about it, because I think that helps both bring into focus the problem, but more importantly, how we can actually address it. So I'm going to start going through some links now, and I'm going to share my screen again, if I can figure out how. I promise I am a technology expert. Okay. And yes, I saw someone say, apologies for being so ignorant, but that is a lot of red pins on the map. And you're absolutely right. It is alarming the degree to which this technology is rapidly being adopted. Again, these dots represent kind of a range of different use cases. Some of these are local and state police that have their own facial recognition systems. Some of these are local and state law enforcement that are availing themselves of the FBI or other federal facial recognition and other biometric surveillance technologies. Some of these are places where police have forged partnerships with Amazon Ring surveillance cameras, which historically did use facial recognition, eventually claimed that they stopped, but those law enforcement agencies can still use facial recognition to analyze the massive amount of video that they're able to obtain. I'm going to have an exciting development specifically related to Amazon Ring that I'll save for the end, not to do too much spoiling of the news. But I think, again, this map should alarm people. But hopefully it should also inspire people a bit. And what I'll do right now is uncheck the kind of use cases and show that, look, there is, it's not the whole country, but there are a bunch of places across the country that have started taking significant steps to curtail the use of facial recognition surveillance. And I think that that is important so that we don't lose hope and just accept that the toothpaste is out of the bottle. I'll quickly address that too, because it's something that you'll hear from tech industry lobbyists, from law enforcement. They'll sort of say like, look, this technology exists, like it's there, we're not going to stop using it. There's a phenomenal essay that a professor from Rhode Island named Evan Selinger wrote for the New York Times that I encourage everyone to look into, where he compares facial recognition to lead paint. And you can actually go back and find almost the exact quotes that people say now about technologies like facial recognition about lead paint, where the companies that made it said, look, it exists, people are using it, we're not going to stop using it. Yes, maybe it has some adverse health effects, but the toothpaste is out of the tube. Like, what do you want us to do about it? Well, we did something about it. We as a society decided it was unacceptable that we were poisoning children and vulnerable people with lead paint. We passed laws and regulations. We made it illegal to continue doing new construction with lead paint. We invested in mitigation strategies and other public policy to address the harm of lead paint. And you do not find lead paint in new construction pretty much anywhere in the US anymore. And so the idea that once the technology exists, we can't decide not to use it or to regulate it or to roll it back is simply false. And I think it's more important than ever that we embrace the reality that we do have power. We don't have to just prostrate ourselves before our tech gods and accept whatever they say we have to accept. We as a society need to make decisions about what types of technology we want to use and what the rules governing it should be. And those decisions are arguably some of the most important decisions that humans are making right now. Okay, I'm going to jump into a little bit more of what's happening and what can we do about it. So I mentioned Spotify and their use of voice recognition surveillance, or their intended use of voice recognition surveillance. But I'm going to jump over now to some of the ways that we've called attention to this technology in Congress. So one of the stunts that Fight for the Future did is we actually conducted our own facial recognition experiment. We purchased Amazon's commercially available facial recognition software, which is called Rekognition with a K, just to make it more sinister. We worked with some local activists in Washington, D.C., who dressed up in these phenomenal little suits, strapped cell phones to their heads, and walked around the halls of Congress, where they scanned thousands of faces. And we actually managed to identify a member of Congress in real time. This is Congressman Mark DeSaulnier of California. But our software also thought that it saw Roy Orbison, who has been deceased, as probably everyone knows, for quite some time. And that kind of was intended to show how facial recognition is dangerous when it works, because it's pretty dangerous if people can just walk around Washington, D.C., identifying members of Congress, journalists, diplomats, anyone else that they want, picking them out of a crowd for God knows what nefarious purpose. But it's also dangerous when this technology misidentifies people, which we've seen borne out in horrific detail. There's now been at least 6 cases of predominantly Black men that have been falsely arrested due to a facial recognition mismatch. And again, as I mentioned before, those mismatches are exacerbated by the fact that most modern facial recognition algorithms perform worse on people with darker skin. But we also just saw another case where an older gentleman is suing Macy's because the store's facial recognition falsely matched him with someone that had robbed them. He was falsely arrested and ended up being sexually assaulted in prison before he was released. So these are examples of where this is not just sort of like, oh, whoopsie, the technology didn't work. Now we have to figure it out. These are life or death scenarios that can lead to irreparable harm. And that's why we need basic policies in place to prevent it. So we were pretty proud of this little stunt that we did in DC, and it did generate quite a lot of attention on the topic and helped generate some legislation that has come out of Congress that hasn't moved yet, but that at least lays the groundwork for how we could regulate facial recognition at the federal level. And what Fight for the Future, the ACLU, and dozens of other racial justice, human rights, and civil liberties organizations have called for is an outright ban on law enforcement and government use of facial recognition. And we believe that it should also be banned for the vast majority of corporate uses. Because again, as I think I outlined, talking about Macy's, talking about other ways that corporations can use this technology, it's just as possible for a company to violate your rights as it is for the government. So to illuminate that a little bit further, I'll jump into a campaign that we ran targeting the use of facial recognition at concerts and music festivals. And this is something that popped up after it became, after the New York Times and other outlets reported that Madison Square Garden specifically was using facial recognition to identify and ban attorneys from law firms that had sued companies owned by the owner of Madison Square Garden. So this had nothing to do with crowd safety or preventing terrorism or keeping stalkers out or whatever. It was literally the owner of the company using this technology for his own vindictive purpose of punishing law firms that dared to challenge his supremacy effectively in the industry. That resonated a lot with music fans. We organized this campaign targeting companies and music festivals, asking them whether they would use this type of technology at their events. And we secured commitments from more than 40 of the world's largest music festivals, as well as many other concert venues, saying that they will not use facial recognition surveillance at their events. We did that by getting prominent artists and musicians, and the fact that I've spent a lot of the last decade in the music world obviously helps us have some of these connections. But we got, for example, folks like Tom Morello and Zach De La Rocha from Rage Against the Machine to say that they would boycott venues that use this type of technology, and that had a major effect. We ran a similar campaign when it became clear that Red Rocks, the iconic music venue in Denver, was using Amazon's new palm scanning devices, which maybe some of you have seen at a Whole Foods near you, for entry to their events. And similarly, we organized a campaign with dozens and dozens of prominent artists saying that they would boycott venues that used Amazon's biometric surveillance technology. And that led to Red Rocks abandoning their pilot program of Amazon's palm scanning technology. And here's a nice article in Rolling Stone about that. And so again, that's an example of where we do have power. We don't have to just accept whatever companies throw at us, whatever the government throws at us. We can organize and we can fight back against this. And I think what's important about this too is that these are collective actions. A lot of times people ask me things like, well, what can I do to protect myself from facial recognition? Or, is there some cool hat that I can wear? Or is there some cool setting that I can change on my phone that will protect me from the type of surveillance that you're talking about? And often what I tell people is, if you want to protect yourself from ubiquitous corporate and government surveillance, it's not about changing the settings on your phone. It's about picking up your phone and calling your senator and your representative and telling them that you want them to enact basic laws that prevent this type of abusive surveillance. Because in the end, this is not something that we can solve by ourselves. It's not something that we can solve by opting out of a specific product or putting on a cool hat. It's a collective and society-wide problem that needs to be solved through policy. And we affect that policy through organizing, activism, agitation, research, and direct pressure on our elected officials and on companies to slow down the spread of this technology and then give us time to build the types of policies we need to protect against the most egregious and abusive uses of it. So I mentioned a few of these campaigns. They've been really successful. This is an op-ed that I wrote with Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine in BuzzFeed News, really touting the success of that campaign that led to so many music festivals stepping away from the use of facial recognition. We later ran a similar campaign with Students for a Sensible Drug Policy that got more than 60 colleges and universities, including MIT, many other prominent colleges in Massachusetts and around the country, say that they wouldn't allow the use of facial recognition surveillance on their campuses. All of that activism and energy and attention and debate leads to ripple effects across the entire ecosystem. And one of the big ones that we saw just before the end of last year was the Federal Trade Commission slapped a massive fine on Rite Aid, the pharmacy chain, because they found that Rite Aid had used facial recognition surveillance on shoppers disproportionately in Black and brown communities and low-income communities in ways that violated people's rights, that they did not have the consent to do. And they actually banned Rite Aid from using facial recognition in their stores for 5 years. So that's an example, again, of where we, the toothpaste did go back in the tube. Here is a company that had rolled out this technology, was using it on their customers without their knowledge or consent, and people fought for and demanded action from the federal government, and the federal government did something about it. And so I highlight that because, again, I think it can become so easy to feel really hopeless in the face of this type of mounting surveillance. It can become very easy to feel like, well, I have to be on Facebook for my job. I have to get on Zoom for my kid to go to school. I carry my phone with me everywhere I go. I have to. I kind of know maybe some of my apps are tracking me, but what can I do about that? And again, I want to tell you all that, like, it's not your fault. You don't need to feel ashamed that you're sort of forced to participate in this surveillance capitalist system, but you're also not powerless to do anything about it. And it's through collective action and organizing that we can make a difference. I'm going to give a few more quick wins, and then I'm going to go over a few things that the ACLU of Massachusetts sort of flagged for me as local opportunities and ways that people can engage. And then I'm going to open it up for questions and make sure that I have as much time as possible to kind of directly engage with people's questions and make sure that I'm covering the stuff that people are most curious about. So this really is sort of a massive topic, and I could talk about any number of pieces of it for any amount of time that folks are interested in. But quickly, I will say that I think, again, it's important to understand that one of the things that makes artificial intelligence powered surveillance so dangerous is that it sort of removes the natural barriers that historically have prevented widespread abuse. So, for example, historically, if police are investigating a crime, they have to dedicate some time and resources to that investigation. They think a robbery has happened. They send some beat cops out to that neighborhood. They knock on doors. They talk to people. All of that takes time and resources and money. As we head toward a world with more and more digital surveillance, we decrease the cost and the friction of those types of investigations, sometimes to the point that it could enable, again, widespread enforcement of rules and norms in a way that we actually don't want. We don't necessarily want a world where every single thing that we do is able to be monitored, analyzed, and potentially punished. And so I think it's really important that we understand that. And one of the most kind of egregious examples of that is Amazon's doorbell cameras, which they've really marketed heavily, especially as through the pandemic, as more and more people have relied on package deliveries and things like that. And historically, Amazon offered police effectively red carpet access to users' video feeds by allowing police to request footage directly from users within the Neighbors app that's attached to these Ring cameras. And just yesterday, after several years of campaigning, primarily led by my colleague Ayele, who's a wonderful activist and campaigner, alongside our allies in the organization Media Justice and the Athena Coalition, we succeeded in getting Amazon to shut down that program, and they will no longer allow police and other law enforcement agencies to request footage from users in the Ring app. Now, law enforcement can still go get a warrant if they want to access that type of information, but that means that they're subject to some basic oversight. They have to prove that they're actually investigating a real crime. They have to show some evidence to suggest that they believe that obtaining this footage would help them investigate that crime, rather than being able to just post in an app and say, hey, everyone send us your footage, and get a bunch of unwitting or perhaps overly willing homeowners to share footage with law enforcement in a manner that effectively creates an end run around our Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. And historically, we actually know that there's documented evidence suggesting that the prevalence of Ring cameras in a neighborhood are directly correlated with racial profiling in that neighborhood. And we've seen on the Neighbors app very frequently people sharing images and video of people of color basically just going about their daily lives, flagging them as suspicious and leading to false stops, in some cases even arrests, exacerbated by this video sharing program, which ended yesterday. So again, an example of where collective action and organizing can make a difference. And this is something that happened not just because of direct pressure on Amazon, but also through local, state, and federal elected officials. And I do want to shout out again our senator from Massachusetts, Senator Markey, who sent several oversight letters to Amazon Ring, asking them tough questions about what types of policies they have in place to prevent the abuse of the data that they collect, about their cybersecurity practices and others. Those types of letters and that type of pressure does make a difference. And so I commend Senator Markey on his work around this. And again, I just suggest to everyone that this shows that when we fight, we can win. And we don't have to accept a world where our neighbors are watching us in our living room through their Ring camera. We don't have to accept a world where our kids are tracked everywhere that they go, through the apps on their phone, through cameras on everyone's doorbells, in their school. We don't have to accept a world where we walk into a retail store and the store automatically knows who we are and gives us tailored deals based on our income, our gender, our race, and other information that they may have about us. That's not the world that I want to live in. I don't think it's the world that any of you all want to live in. And I invite you all to join the growing movement for tech justice that's trying to build a world where technology is predominantly a force for good and for empowerment, where we can use technology to ensure that everyone has access to the universal library of human knowledge and creativity, rather than using it to enrich the rich and entrench power among those that already have it. So that's a bit of my kind of basic spiel on this, but very quickly before I wrap up the kind of main section and turn to questions, I will just go through two concrete things that folks here in Massachusetts can do if they care about this issue and want to get more involved. So one is that Massachusetts could become one of the first states in the country to pass a strong law preventing the collection and sale of your cell phone location data. And this is an issue that has really come into focus, especially in the post-Roe era, where we already know that law enforcement in states where abortion and abortion-related activities are being criminalized, it's incredibly dangerous that law enforcement could use people's cell phone location data to determine if they left the state in order to access reproductive health care. Some states are even passing what are called abortion trafficking laws, where they would make it illegal for you to transport someone else out of the state for the purpose of helping them acquire gender affirming care or abortion related care. And so your cell phone location data is arguably some of the most sensitive data that all of us collect. And the ACLU of Massachusetts and a broad coalition are pushing for the Location Shield Act, which is a measure here in Massachusetts that would crack down on the collection and sale of cell phone location data. And they have an action up here that you can go do so that you can reach out to your local elected officials and tell them you want them to support the Location Shield Act. And then what I'll do is I'll actually drop this link right here in the chat so that you can go find it very easily. And then the second one is that I mentioned we have in several cities in Massachusetts, we have a ban on the use of facial recognition surveillance, but there's still an ongoing push from the ACLU to ban it statewide. And so this is another campaign that folks can get involved in. And I just would encourage everyone to follow on social media or otherwise check in with the ACLU of Massachusetts. My organization, Fight for the Future, is very nationally focused. So you can certainly check us out, get on our email list, follow us on social media as well. But in terms of doing stuff right here in Massachusetts, in your own backyard, this is the ACLU of Massachusetts is a great resource to check in with in terms of the current campaigns that they have going on. So that is kind of my very rapid overview of a topic that we could easily spend, a whole college course on. Maybe it has left you feeling a bit like this. And I do, unfortunately, have to remind you that it can always get worse. But I'll leave it there with a bit of a thank you and ways to get in touch with me. And then in just a moment, I'll stop sharing my screen. And please do start dropping some questions in the chat. And I can try to kind of tackle those a bit one by one. And Matt, since you put this together, feel free to kind of jump in and call me out on stuff that you think maybe I missed or glossed over too quickly, or that questions that you have that you think others may want to have answered. I invite you to kind of put that facilitator hat on as well. So I'll take a breath. I'll drink a little bit of water and let folks drop their questions in the chat, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Evan. This is an amazing presentation. You covered so much, and your organization that does so much work. And I'm very happy to see all the results that you're promoting. As people are typing questions, I can start at least reading some of the ones that have been put in so far. But one is, what about websites demanding you accept cookies before viewing the content? Is that driven by or fuels artificial intelligence? If so, how to get around those walls in order to view the content?
I'm going to stop sharing so I can talk to folks. Yeah, this is a great question. And I think, again, this sort of illuminates the relationship between sort of traditional commercial surveillance and artificial intelligence powered surveillance. So when you see that alert on the website that wants you to accept the cookies, or when you sign up for a service and you scroll through the 10 pages of terms of service and don't read any of it, and even if you did read it, you would need 3 different attorneys to explain it to you. All of that is sort of the underpinning of this surveillance-driven business model that is employed by the vast majority of websites and apps and tech that we use, even kind of things that you think of as innocuous. Like, one thing that I always find funny is I read New York Times stories about things like privacy invasions, and then I go to my ad tracker and I see all the ways that the New York Times itself is tracking my activity, because the New York Times, in the end, is primarily an advertising-based company, and their online properties are making revenue through advertising, and advertising is more profitable the more targeted you can make it. And so I'm just going to kind of go back to the breadth of the question, but broadly speaking, not every website that's asking whether they can collect your data is inherently using that information for artificial intelligence. But the more data about you that's out there, the more public photos, the more information that you hand over to private companies, the more that people can build these types of surveillance or predictive applications on top of that. And so that's why when we sort of think about what are the solutions to artificial intelligence, I would argue that it's sort of about going back to that root and preventing sort of the fuel supply, if you will, by cutting off the ability of companies to collect so much data about us in the first place. And I can quickly move on. I see, so this is a related question. So someone has asked, has my organization, Fight for the Future, written a model federal privacy law, and who is against such a law? So this is a great question. And so the primary answer is like, Fight for the Future itself, we see ourselves as more of like a grassroots advocacy organization. We work closely with sort of policy shops like the Center for Democracy and Technology, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, like Public Knowledge, et cetera. Those are the type of organizations that tend to work more closely on drafting specific legislation. We're kind of the ones that come in and beat up the politicians until they do what we want them to do or stop them from doing what we don't in a peaceful, nonviolent, progressive way. But we absolutely do have sort of red lines of what we think any strong privacy legislation should contain. And the basics of it are that we believe it should prohibit widespread over collection of data in the first place, rather than simply asking people to consent. And I think that that's really important because tech companies have sort of made a mockery of our concept of consent. When we think about consent within romantic relationships, we understand that you can't give consent to your boss. If your boss comes on to you, they're using their power that they have over you. And even if you're interested in the relationship, that's not meaningful consent. We understand that you can't consent if you're intoxicated or if you don't know that the person that's asking you to kiss them has oral herpes, for example, right? Those are not meaningful forms of consent. And so when a tech company asks you, hey, can we collect all of your data and use it for whatever purpose we want? And you say yes, because you have to say yes in order to use that service, that's not meaningful consent. That's actually coercion. And so we've seen sort of a lot of weak industry-backed privacy regulations that are basically based on that idea of like, well, as long as we asked you and you said yes, then we can do whatever we want, right? And that, again, is not a meaningful protection. If the only hospital near you uses facial recognition and they have a big sign on the door that says, by entering this hospital, you consent to our use of facial recognition. That's not meaningful consent if you break your leg and you have to go to that hospital. And so that's why we support privacy legislation that strictly prohibits companies from collecting data that they don't need in order to provide you with the service that you have requested from them. We also support legislation that prevents the use of data for purposes that discriminate or violate existing civil rights protection. And to be clear, we have our sort of pie in the sky ideal of what we would love a privacy law to be, but there also is an actual real bipartisan privacy law called the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, or ADPA, that was introduced last Congress. It moved out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It has support from both Democrats and Republicans. It's not perfect. Very few laws are, but it would be a significant improvement on our status quo. And that is a law that Fight for the Future supports. There's a wide range of other laws that tackle kind of different pieces of this. There's a great law called the My Body, My Data Act that was introduced by a California representative in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade that specifically focuses on protecting people's healthcare and medical and reproductive data. And there's a number of other provisions out there that we would support. There's also a lot that agencies like the Federal Trade Commission can do, even if Congress doesn't act, which I will be real with you is unfortunately the most likely scenario for at least the next short while, right? We're heading into an election year. Partisanship is already at an all-time high. I do not have a tremendous amount of faith that Congress is going to enact meaningful regulations in this area in the near future, but we can make a lot of progress at the local and state level in the meantime, and we can push for the Federal Trade Commission and other federal agencies to use as much of their authority as possible. So I already mentioned, for example, the FTC banning Rite Aid from using facial recognition in their stores. we've called on, for example, the Department of Education could issue guidance against the use of artificial intelligence-powered surveillance systems in schools. Now, that's not the same as a federal law banning it, but it's pretty strong. If the Department of Education says this is the guidance and schools don't follow it, they're risking their ability to get federal grants, for example. And so the federal government does have significant power to limit, restrict the ability of agencies, of institutions to use this technology in harmful ways. And thanks to the work of a broad coalition of activists and researchers and academics, the Biden administration has made some progress on this. Biden issued an executive order about 2 months ago that was pretty comprehensive and directed almost every government agency in the US to do an assessment of how they're already using artificial intelligence, how they might use it in the future, what kinds of safeguards they have in place. It prompted a number of comment processes through which organizations like mine can now rally our troops to say, here's what we think you should do. And so there is some amount of interest and openness in this, and it is a bit bipartisan. And there's a question also in the chat about, what can folks do in states that are not as liberal as Massachusetts? And again, I think it's important to recognize that this is one of those issues that sort of does bring together a broad constellation of people. Fight for the Future's email list has about 2 million people on it. And I would say that, a lot of them are progressives and liberals and leftists and whatever, but I absolutely get emails from people who are, as far right as they come and are just as worried about government surveillance as I am. And so this is something that I think does kind of cut across traditional ideological lines, and where, regardless of what else we believe, many, many people agree that we don't want corporations to collect our data and use that data to manipulate us. Many, many people agree that we don't want our government to be able to interfere with our basic rights and civil liberties. Many, many people agree that we want freedom to associate. We want the ability to go to a protest or a place of worship without being tracked or monitored. And these are issues that do kind of cut across these historical partisan lines. And we have seen some bipartisan interest in this in Congress and around the country. And so it's not necessarily something where we can only make progress in a place here like Massachusetts. We have seen some progress on this in purple states and red states. Michigan is a state where there's been some progress on this. And so, it's not necessarily a traditional left-right issue. And again, that's where we perhaps have some opportunity, and it doesn't have to become something that's quite so everyone in their camp as other historical issues. We have a little bit of, we have a short window of time, I would say, during which we can still seize on this opportunity to put some policies in place to ensure that the type of future we're heading for is one that we want our kids to grow up in. And that's really, what this comes down to for me. So often we talk about things like surveillance as being about, these really extreme scenarios. We're stopping kidnappers and terrorists and, child molesters, et cetera. And it can be framed so much about like, well, think of the children, or, think of, and what I say is I am thinking of the children. I'm thinking of my child, and I want her to grow up in a world where she has basic rights and where she has an ability to express herself and where she has an ability to change the world that she's living in and not just accept it. And to me, that's a world that's free from ubiquitous and overbearing surveillance.
There's another question. I think you illustrated some of this, but I'll read the whole question. Is enough being done to organize against the large scale indiscriminate scraping of web data to fuel generative AI? Data poisoning is interesting, but efficacy remains to be seen. And the New York Times case against OpenAI is promising too, but then other countries have specifically said they're not going to enforce any protections for anyone. Is there any momentum behind stopping this?
Yeah, this is like the question of the hour. So thank you, Christopher. And this is a pretty sophisticated question, so I'll try and give a somewhat nuanced and sophisticated answer. So there's a few different things at play here. One is, the architecture of the web, and that many existing websites have been built in such a way that allows this type of scraping at scale. And so there are technical measures that companies and websites can and will take to kind of mitigate that or make it slower or more difficult to do. But this New York Times case is actually what I would argue an example of the sort of wrong approach, where rather than focusing on the underlying problem of surveillance, it's attempting to take this in the direction of intellectual property enforcement and basically saying like, well, you're training your AI model on our intellectual property and that violates our copyright. That sort of brings things in a different direction that, from my perspective, undermines some of the fundamental principles that have actually made the better parts of the internet possible, like fair use. So, for example, Wikipedia is a service that probably many people use. It's generally seen as a public good. It is only able to exist thanks to fair use and the ability for them to report on, to use copyrighted material in ways that are clearly in the public interest and not for a for-profit purpose. If we start to try to say that we're going to fight against the use of training by enforcing intellectual property law, we start to undermine that concept of fair use. So I would actually argue that the way that we combat kind of ubiquitous AI scraping and the training of AI systems on people's content without their consent is more through privacy and kind of the architecture of sites than through expanding or otherwise kind of relying on the intellectual property regime, which in the end is driven in itself by surveillance, right? The only way that you can meaningfully enforce a policy like that would be forcing websites to scan for content and determine whether it could have been generated from someone else's copyrighted material. We see this already where YouTube, for example, uses Content ID to search for material that they believe to be copyrighted. And we know that that system has been frequently abused to take down, for example, videos that are critical of politicians or corporations where they claim intellectual property as a mechanism through which to take them down. Even Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the rights of which were purchased by EMI, was frequently removed from YouTube because EMI would submit copyright requests to take it down from YouTube. And so, that's just my little rant. I'm not despite the fact that I made a living as a musician for more than a decade, I'm not personally a big fan of kind of copyright and intellectual property maximalism as a mechanism for protecting human rights. My perspective is that we need to find other ways to ensure that artists and creators and writers are fairly compensated for their labor, and then to ensure that AI systems are not unduly using people's data and information without permission or consent in ways that lead to harm or violate people's rights.
Thank you. I have a silly question that we can maybe end with.
Sure.
Are there any ways in which facial recognition technology is beneficial?
So I would argue no, not with facial recognition, but let's zoom out to AI more generally, because I think this is an interesting topic. And this actually touches on kind of what I was just getting at a little bit with talking about kind of copyright and generative AI. I think it's important that we recognize that in the end, these systems are just tools, and tools can be used for good or for evil. And in the end, it really depends on like who has the power, right? And who has the power in the situation. So, for example, that song that I played for you all at the very beginning of this presentation, you heard the drums in that song, and you were like, wow, Evan Greer's a really good drummer. The drums in that song were almost entirely artificial intelligence drums that come default in GarageBand, which is free software that comes with almost everyone's iPad or Mac. And they are samples of real drums played by a real person. And almost every modern artist uses a drum machine like that. And, there's a valid argument to be made that that type of software puts some amount of session drummers out of a job. And it's true that that software allowed me, a transgender anti-capitalist punk musician, to record and release an album for a fraction of the cost that I might have otherwise. and get my thoughts and my art and my perspective into the world in a way that I otherwise would not have been able to because of the barrier of that cost. And so that's an example of where this technology has potentially a democratizing effect, where it could dramatically lower the cost of creating a certain type of work or art that otherwise would be prohibited, right? And that's, I think, kind of strikes at the complexity of this and helps us recognize that, broadly speaking, very few technologies are all good or all bad, right? Facial recognition, I actually would sort of put in that category, and some researchers have compared it to like nuclear or biological weapons, just in terms of like the scale of harm it's capable of doing so greatly outweighs any of the potential benefits that really the only solution to it is sort of deproliferation. But when you kind of start to back away from like that level of AI use, there are a wide range of other uses of AI that I think are interesting and worth exploring, and where it's more about how do we ensure that communities that have been historically oppressed and subjugated are not powerless? How do we ensure that the people who will be most affected by the use of an AI system have decision-making power and oversight over that system and the ability to audit it and determine whether it's leading to the type of outcomes that we want? So in the end, it's sort of the funny thing of we're worried about these robots, but really these are human problems. And it's about us as humans making agreements about what do we want these robots to do and what do we want them not to do. And which type of robots do we want to build? Which type of robots do we want to agree we should never, ever, ever build? And that's really the moment that we're in as a society, and one that I think, just requires the best of our brains, the best of humanity is needed right now to decide, because these decisions that we're making about technology are going to affect not just the next decade or the next few decades, but the entire future of human civilization. So pressure's on, people. What are we going to do?
Evan, thank you so much for tonight's talk. It was truly wonderful and so informative. And thank you everyone for your questions. This program was recorded and will be on the library's YouTube channel after this, and I'll be sure to send out a recap with links to Fight for the Future and Evan's music, and I'll try to find some things throughout the talk that you pointed to send out as links as well. But thank you so much, Evan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Matt. Really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. Great to have some folks here on a Thursday night.
Have a good night, everyone.